The Resonance Matrix, Volume 2, Episode 7, Gaslighting, When Knowing Becomes Uncertainty. Hello, and welcome to the Resonance Matrix, the Mirror Linguistic Hypothesis series, and Volume 2, The Anatomy of Influence and the Linguistic Somatic Decode, Episode 7, Gaslighting, When Knowing Becomes Uncertainty. There is a moment, often difficult to locate in memory, when certainty begins to loosen. Not certainty in the sense of facts or opinions, but something more intimate and foundational. The quiet confidence that your internal sense of things is reliable. The feeling that what you notice, what you feel, what registers in your body before words arrive, that this can be trusted. Gaslighting does not begin when someone contradicts you. It begins when that trust starts to waver. This episode opens there, not at the point of conflict, but at the point of hesitation. The moment when a thought that once would have passed unnoticed now stalls. The moment when a feeling that once would have been taken at face value is suddenly re-examined. The moment when you begin to ask yourself not what is happening, but whether you are qualified to know. Gaslighting is often described as a tactic, a behavior, or a form of psychological manipulation. But those descriptions, while useful, arrive too late in the process. By the time gaslighting is visible as a pattern, something more fundamental has already shifted. The ground beneath perception has softened. The internal reference point, the place where sensation becomes meaning, has already been disturbed. This episode is not about identifying perpetrators. It is not about assigning blame. It is not about diagnosing individuals or relationships. It is about understanding how knowing itself becomes unstable, and how that instability is produced not through force, but through language tone, repetition, and context. To understand gaslighting, we must begin by acknowledging something uncomfortable. It does not work on people who are weak, naive, or unintelligent. It works on people who are open, reflective, relational, and willing to question themselves. It works on people who value accuracy over dominance, harmony over conflict, and coherence over certainty. Gaslighting does not reward arrogance. It exploits humility, and it does so by slowly reframing humility as unreliability. In the previous episodes of this series, we have moved through a progression of influence that mirrors a gradual descent in autonomy. In Phase 3, we began with deception, where reality fractures just enough to create confusion, but not enough to provoke defense. Then came provocation, where emotional energy is stirred and harvested, pulling the nervous system into reactive states that narrow perception. After that, seduction softened vigilance entirely, offering comfort, relief, and a sense of safety that made checking feel unnecessary. Gaslighting does not arrive into clarity. It arrives into relief. By the time gaslighting begins to take hold, the nervous system is no longer braced. It is open. The guard has dropped. The body has accepted regulation from outside itself. Warmth has replaced vigilance. Ease has replaced effort. And it is precisely at this point, when the system is most receptive, that doubt can be introduced without resistance. Gaslighting is not loud. It does not shout. It does not threaten. It speaks calmly. It sounds reasonable. It often wears the language of care, concern, or objectivity, and because it does not feel like an attack, it bypasses the systems that would normally respond to one. At its core, gaslighting is not about convincing you of a false reality. It is about convincing you that your access to reality is flawed. This is a crucial distinction. A lie can be challenged. An argument can be debated. A false claim can be disproven. But if the issue is framed not as what is true, but as whether you are capable of knowing what is true, then the terrain shifts entirely. Gaslighting does not say, "This didn't happen." It says, "Are you sure that's how it happened?" It does not say you're wrong. It says you might be misremembering. It does not say your feelings are invalid. It says you're being emotional, let's be objective. Each of these statements, taken in isolation, appears benign, even healthy. Reflection, objectivity, and emotional awareness are all virtues in a functional, relational environment. But gaslighting works not through any single statement. It works through accumulation, through repetition, through consistency, through tone. Over time, the nervous system begins to register a pattern. When internal signals arise, they are met not with curiosity or engagement, but with gentle correction. And because the correction is calm, measured, and often framed as helpful, the body does not interpret it as a threat. Instead, it adapts. Adaptation is one of the nervous system's greatest strengths. When environments are stable and supportive, adaptation allows for growth, learning, and connection. But when adaptation occurs within an environment that subtly undermines internal reference, it becomes a liability. The body begins to hesitate before responding. Speech slows. Expression becomes cautious. Internal sensations are filtered through imagined external reactions. This is not overthinking. It is a predictive adjustment. The nervous system, having learned that certain expressions lead to correction or invalidation, begins to preemptively dampen them, not consciously. automatically, and this is where gaslighting becomes so difficult to articulate to others. From the outside, nothing appears overtly wrong. There are no raised voices, no obvious cruelty, no clear violations. The individual experiencing gaslighting may even appear calm, composed, and reasonable, but internally, something has shifted. There is a growing distance between sensation and expression, a lag between feeling and knowing, a doubt that arrives before clarity can form. And because this doubt feels self-generated, it is rarely recognized as an influence. Within the framework of the mirror linguistic hypothesis, this process can be understood as a disruption of somatic receipt, the body's immediate, precognitive registration of experience. Under normal conditions, somatic signals act as the first data point in meaning making. A tightening in the chest, a warmth in the body, a sense of expansion or contraction, these signals inform cognition, which then contextualizes them. Gaslighting interrupts this sequence. The signal still arrives, but its authority is questioned. The body registers something, but before cognition can integrate it, a secondary process activates. Is this accurate? Am I interpreting this correctly? How will this be received? Meaning is no longer built from the inside out. It is negotiated externally. This is not because the body has failed. It is because the environment has trained the system to doubt its own inputs. Mirror linguistic hypothesis field theory helps us understand why this process is so powerful. Gaslighting rarely exists as a single interaction. It exists within a field, a relational, organizational, or cultural environment that consistently reinforces certain narratives while quietly destabilizing others. In such fields, doubt becomes normalized. Certainty is framed as rigidity. Self-trust is subtly pathologized. The field does not need to be overtly hostile. In fact, hostility would break the spell. The field must remain reasonable, balanced, and concerned. It must feel like a place where questioning yourself is a sign of intelligence, not vulnerability. And so the individual adapts again. They become more careful with words, more tentative with feelings, more reliant on external validation, not because they are weak, but because the field rewards this adaptation. One of the most painful aspects of gaslighting is that it often coexists with moments of genuine connection. There may be warmth, affection, support, even encouragement. This inconsistency deepens the confusion. If the environment were entirely hostile, the nervous system would mobilize. But when care and invalidation coexist, the system cannot resolve the contradiction. Instead, it internalizes it. Maybe the problem is me. Maybe I'm misreading things. Maybe I need to be clearer, less reactive. These thoughts do not arise from pathology. They arise from a nervous system attempting to maintain coherence in an incoherent environment. Gaslighting is particularly effective in contexts where there is an implicit power asymmetry. This does not have to be a formal authority. It can be emotional, social, or symbolic power. The person or system doing the gaslighting may be perceived as more stable, more rational, more informed, or more grounded. In such contexts, the individual experiencing gaslighting may feel that questioning the narrative would risk not just disagreement, but disconnection. And because we are deeply relational beings, the nervous system often chooses connection over clarity, not consciously, automatically. As this episode unfolds, we will explore gaslighting not as a moral failing or a manipulative trick, but as a relational injury, one that affects perception, memory, confidence, and bodily trust. We will look at how language functions not just as communication, but as regulation, how tone shapes meaning before content is processed, how repetition trains expectation, how doubt, once internalized, becomes self-sustaining. We will also look forward, beyond current diagnostic frameworks, toward emerging understandings of psychological harm that focus less on personality labels and more on epistemic injury. The damage done when a person's capacity to know themselves and their world is systematically undermined. This is not about creating suspicion. It is about restoring orientation. As you listen to this episode, you may recognize moments from your own life. Conversations where you left feeling smaller than when you arrived. Situations where you began rehearsing perceptions before sharing them. Moments where clarity dissolved not during conflict, but after calm discussion. If that recognition arises, let it do so gently. Nothing here asks you to confront, accuse, or expose. This work is not about reaction. It is about return to the body, return to sensation, return to the place where knowing begins before it is explained. Gaslighting loses its power not when it is named, but when internal reference is allowed to stabilize again. That stabilization begins not with certainty, but with permission. Permission to trust the first signal. Permission to pause before correcting yourself. Permission to let meaning emerge from sensation rather than being negotiated away. This episode begins there, not at the moment of collapse, but at the moment when knowing first hesitated, and the body learned to wait for permission to speak. The atmospheric hook, The subtle undermining gaslighting does not arrive as chaos, it arrives as calm. It enters the room quietly, already seated, already reasonable, already framed as neutral ground. There is no rupture at first, no spike of fear, no obvious threat that would mobilize the nervous system into defense. In fact, one of the most disarming aspects of gaslighting is that it often feels like the opposite of danger. It feels like order. This is where the erosion begins. Most people imagine influence as something that pushes, something that persuades loudly or overwhelms forcefully. But gaslighting does not push the system forward. It gently reorients it sideways, just enough that internal reference begins to drift. The voice is steady, the tone is measured, the language is composed. Nothing here triggers an alarm, and because nothing triggers an alarm, the body does not mobilize. Instead, it listens. The atmosphere of gaslighting is not hostile, it is corrective. It carries the subtle implication that something needs adjusting, not in the environment, not in the situation, but in you, in your interpretation, in your memory, in your emotional calibration. And because this correction is offered calmly, often with apparent care, the nervous system does not experience it as an intrusion. It experiences it as guidance. This is critical. Gaslighting depends on the body remaining in a socially engaged state. It cannot work if the system shifts into fight or flight. It requires the ventral vagal channel to remain open, receptive, relational, oriented toward connection. So the atmosphere stays smooth. You may notice this atmosphere most clearly not during the conversation, but after it. A delayed confusion, a sense of fog, a subtle depletion that wasn't present beforehand. You replay the interaction not because it was intense, but because something in it failed to land. Words were exchanged, points were made, responses were given, and yet clarity did not arrive. Instead, there is a faint sense that something was taken, not information, but confidence, not memory, but trust in memory. Gaslighting often begins with a small, almost imperceptible shift in relational rhythm. You speak, there is a pause. A correction follows, not abrupt, not sharp, just enough to interrupt momentum, and because we are relational by nature, momentum matters. When momentum is interrupted repeatedly, expression becomes tentative. The body begins to hold back slightly, waiting to see whether what arises internally will be met with acceptance or adjustment. This waiting is not conscious, it is somatic anticipation. The nervous system begins to predict that internal signals may require modification before they are safe to express. From the perspective of the mirror linguistic hypothesis, this is where linguistic mirroring turns against the individual. Language no longer reflects the speaker's internal state to them. Instead, it reflects a corrected version, one that subtly suggests misalignment between sensation and meaning. You're probably just tired. I think you're reading into it. That's not quite how it happened. None of these statements denies experience outright. They reframe it, and reframing, when repeated, trains the nervous system to doubt the original signal. The field in which gaslighting occurs is crucial. This is not a single sentence, a single disagreement, or a single contradiction. It is an environmental consistency, a pattern that repeats across time, tone, and context. Within such a field, contradiction becomes normalized. Not aggressive contradiction, not argumentative contradiction, but a reasonable contradiction. Because the contradiction is framed as rational, measured, or even supportive, the body adapts to it as a baseline condition. Adaptation, again, is not failure. It is intelligence. One of the defining atmospheric qualities of gaslighting is that it collapses polarity. There is no clear antagonist, no obvious conflict to resolve, no moment where one can say, this is wrong. Instead, there is an ongoing ambiguity, and ambiguity is metabolically expensive. The nervous system prefers resolution. When resolution is unavailable, it seeks the next best thing, alignment. If alignment with internal sensation no longer produces clarity, the system begins to align externally instead. This is how internal reference weakens, not through attack, but through replacement. In gaslighting environments, reality is rarely denied outright. Instead, it is softened, qualified, or contextualized to the point where its original shape is lost. Memory becomes negotiable, emotion becomes suspect, certainty becomes arrogance, and doubt becomes virtuous. This is where gaslighting begins to feel like maturity. To question oneself is framed as growth. To hesitate is framed as insight. To defer to others is framed as openness. All of these can be healthy in the right context, but when they are consistently directed inward and never outward, something destabilizes. The nervous system begins to associate self-trust with risk. The atmosphere of gaslighting is particularly potent in spaces that value civility, professionalism, or emotional restraint. In such spaces, overt conflict is discouraged. Tone is prioritized over content. Emotional expression is managed carefully. Gaslighting thrives here because it aligns perfectly with the stated values of the environment. It does not need to violate norms. it uses them. You may notice that in gaslighting environments, the burden of clarity is asymmetrical. One person explains more, clarifies more, and one justifies more. The other remains steady, unperturbed, and composed. This asymmetry is not accidental. It signals to the nervous system where authority resides, and authority, when calm, is deeply regulating, which is why the body often aligns with it, even when something feels wrong. From a field theory perspective, gaslighting functions as signal dampening. Internal signals still arise, a discomfort, a sense of mismatch, a felt incongruence, but they are met with external signals that down-regulate their importance. Over time, the body learns that these internal signals do not lead to resolution, so it stops prioritizing them. This is not repression, it is adaptive filtering. What makes gaslighting particularly destabilizing is that it rarely announces itself. There is no clear transition point, no before and after, only a gradual sense that something once reliable now requires verification. You may find yourself checking messages repeatedly, replaying conversations, asking others for confirmation. This is not insecurity. It is a system attempting to re-establish reference in an environment where reference has become unstable. The tragedy of gaslighting is that it often coexists with genuine connection. Moments of warmth, shared laughter, mutual support. These moments are real, and their reality makes the erosion harder to detect, because if something feels good sometimes, the nervous system assumes it is fundamentally safe, and so it tolerates instability elsewhere. This tolerance is not irrational, it is relational. Gaslighting does not require intent. Many people who participate in gaslighting dynamics do not experience themselves as manipulative. They may genuinely believe they are being helpful, grounding, or rational. This is why framing gaslighting as bad behavior often misses the point. The harm does not arise from malice. It arises from patterned invalidation, from a relational structure in which one internal reference is consistently subordinated to another. As this episode unfolds, it is important to hold a non-moral stance. Gaslighting is not about villains and victims. It is about environments that destabilize knowing. Those environments can exist in relationships, workplaces, institutions, families, and cultures, often without anyone consciously choosing them. This section is meant to orient you to the feel of gaslighting, not to define it exhaustively. If recognition arises, let it arise slowly. There is no need to name anything yet. Gaslighting dissolves not through exposure, but through re-anchoring, and re-anchoring begins with recognizing the atmosphere in which internal reference begins to erode. In the next section, we will move deeper into the language of gaslighting, not as a list of phrases, but as a pattern of meaning shaping that separate sensation from interpretation and teaches the body to defer. For now, simply notice this. Gaslighting does not feel like danger. It feels like being corrected gently enough that you begin correcting yourself, and that is where the erosion truly begins. Etymology and definition: from illumination to illusion. Before gaslighting was a psychological term, it was a metaphor, and before it was a metaphor, it was a physical experience. The word gaslighting entered public language through the 1938 stage play Gaslight, later adapted into a film. In the story, a man manipulates his wife by subtly dimming the gas-powered lights in their home while insisting that nothing has changed. When she notices the shift and questions it, he calmly denies her perception, suggesting instead that she is imagining things, becoming unstable, or losing her grip on reality. What makes the story unsettling is not the lie itself, it is the denial of perception. The light does not go out. The room is not plunged into darkness. The change is gradual, ambiguous, and easy to doubt, and crucially, the denial is delivered calmly. This is where the term derives its power. Gaslighting does not operate through obvious falsehood. It operates through plausible ambiguity. Over time, the term migrated from theater into psychology, culture, and everyday language. In that migration, something important was often lost. Gaslighting became shorthand for manipulation, lying, or abuse, descriptors that, while sometimes accurate, miss the deeper mechanism. Gaslighting is not defined by what is said. It is defined by what happens to the listener's capacity to trust their own sensory and emotional registration. That is the core. Within the resonance matrix, gaslighting is not treated as a personality trait or a tactic deployed by a specific kind of person. It is treated as a process, a relational and linguistic pattern that alters how meaning is generated. Here is the working definition used throughout this volume. Gaslighting is the sustained linguistic and relational process by which an individual's internal sensory reference is destabilized, such that external framing becomes more authoritative than direct perception. This definition is precise for a reason. Gaslighting is not a single lie, a disagreement, a difference in memory, a moment of correction. All of those can occur in healthy relationships. Gaslighting begins when destabilization becomes consistent. The key word here is reference. A sensory reference is the internal baseline from which meaning is formed. It includes bodily sensations, emotional responses, intuitive pattern recognition, and the felt sense of something is off under normal conditions. This reference point is trusted implicitly. It is not analyzed. It does not need to be justified. It simply informs thought. Gaslighting does not erase this reference. It undermines confidence in it. Historically, the power of gaslighting has always depended on the environment, not just interaction. In the original story, the woman is not gaslit in public. She is gaslit in a controlled domestic environment, where information is limited, alternative perspectives are absent, and authority is unevenly distributed. This is not incidental. Gaslighting requires a field in which perception can be isolated, questioned, and reinterpreted without immediate contradiction. As the term evolved, this insight was often overlooked. Gaslighting was reduced to interpersonal behavior rather than recognized as a field-dependent phenomenon. In modern usage, gaslighting is often framed as intentional manipulation. While intent can be present, it is not required. From a structural perspective, gaslighting occurs whenever one party consistently reframes another's perception. The reframing is delivered calmly and authoritatively. The original perception is treated as unreliable, and this pattern repeats over time. Intent does not determine impact. Consistency does. Another important distinction must be made here. Gaslighting is not the same as persuasion. Persuasion attempts to change what you believe. Gaslighting attempts to change whether you trust your beliefs at all. This is why gaslighting is so destabilizing. Beliefs can be revised, frameworks can be updated, opinions can change. But when the mechanism that forms belief is damaged, the entire system becomes unstable. Within mirror-linguistic hypothesis field theory, MLHFT, this is understood as a disruption in the mirror loop between environment and nervous system. Language normally mirrors experience back to the speaker, helping them stabilize and refine meaning. In gaslighting, language mirrors doubt instead, not aggressively, not obviously, but persistently. Over time, the nervous system adapts by lowering the priority of its own signals. This is not a psychological weakness. It is a biological economy. It is also important to note what gaslighting is not. It is not healthy disagreement, accountability, feedback, challenge, and growth-oriented reflection. These processes strengthen internal reference when done well. Gaslighting weakens it. The difference is not in content, but in directionality. In healthy dialogue, meaning moves back and forth. In gaslighting, the meaning moves one way. Culturally, gaslighting has expanded beyond individual relationships into institutions, workplaces, media, and even collective narratives. When systems rewrite recent history without acknowledgement, deny lived experience while citing objectivity, frame emotional response as irrational rather than informative, gaslighting becomes ambient. At this scale, it is no longer experienced as abuse. It is experienced as confusion. Future diagnostic frameworks are already beginning to move toward language that reflects this shift. Rather than focusing solely on disorders or traits, emerging models examine epistemic trust, perceptual stability, interoceptive confidence, and relational coherence. Gaslighting fits naturally within these frameworks as an epistemic injury, harm done to the system that generates meaning rather than to any single belief. This is an important evolution. It moves us away from moralizing behavior and toward understanding structural harm. To name gaslighting accurately is not to accuse. It is to orient. Orientation restores agency not by confrontation, but by clarity. And clarity begins with definition. In the next section, we will move forward from naming into how gaslighting hooks cognition, how doubt becomes framed as intelligence, and self-questioning becomes a virtue rather than a choice. For now, let this definition settle. Gaslighting is not about making you believe something false. It is about making you unsure whether you can trust the part of you that knows. The cognitive hook doubt as intelligence gaslighting does not begin by telling you that you are wrong. If it did, it would fail. It begins by inviting you to be reasonable. The first move is almost always framed as care, clarity, or mutual understanding. It arrives as a gentle correction, a reframing, a suggestion that perhaps something has been misunderstood. The language is measured. The tone is calm. Nothing feels overtly aggressive. In fact, the atmosphere often feels mature, emotionally regulated, and even reassuring. This is the cognitive doorway. Gaslighting works not by attacking intelligence, but by recruiting it. At the center of gaslighting is a deceptively simple proposition. A thoughtful person should question themselves. This idea is culturally reinforced, socially rewarded, and often personally valued. Reflection is framed as growth. Self-questioning is framed as depth. Certainty, by contrast, is subtly pathologized as arrogance, defensiveness, or emotional immaturity. Within this frame, doubt becomes evidence of intelligence. And this is the hook. Once doubt is framed as virtue, the internal reference point becomes negotiable, not discarded outright, but placed under review. Sensations, intuitions, and emotional signals are no longer treated as data, they are treated as hypotheses, tentative, provisional, requiring external confirmation. Gaslighting does not ask you to abandon your perception, it asks you to suspend trust in it. The cognitive mechanism at work here is not persuasion, but epistemic destabilization. Under ordinary conditions, meaning is generated through a quiet collaboration between perception, memory, emotion, and interpretation. You feel something, you notice it, and meaning forms almost automatically. There is no need to justify this process, it is assumed to be reliable. Gaslighting intervenes in this process by introducing friction at the level of interpretation. It inserts a pause where none previously existed, and then fills that pause with suggestion. Are you sure that's what happened? I don't remember it that way. You might be reading into this. That sounds more like a feeling than a fact. Each statement, taken in isolation, is reasonable, even responsible, but repetition changes function. Over time, these phrases do not correct individual errors. They reframe the act of perceiving itself as unreliable. The result is not immediate confusion, but delayed certainty. You still feel what you feel. You simply no longer know what to do with it. This is why gaslighting is so difficult to detect cognitively. It does not create false beliefs. It creates indecision about belief formation. It does not replace your version of events with another. It creates a sense that there may be no stable version at all. In this state, the mind becomes preoccupied not with understanding reality, but with monitoring itself. Was I too sensitive? Did I misremember? Am I projecting? Am I being unfair? These questions feel intelligent. They sound self-aware. They signal emotional literacy. But when they become chronic, they no longer serve clarity. They serve paralysis. A crucial aspect of gaslighting's cognitive hook is that it often aligns with values the individual already holds. Many people who are vulnerable to gaslighting pride themselves on being reflective, empathic, nuanced, and open to feedback. They value dialogue over certainty. They dislike rigidity. They see themselves as fair-minded. Gaslighting leverages this self-concept. The more someone identifies as thoughtful, the easier it becomes to frame certainty as a flaw. The internal logic becomes, if I were truly mature, I would not feel so sure. This creates a quiet inversion. Confidence is recoded as ego, clarity is recoded as defensiveness, and doubt is elevated to the status of moral good. Once this inversion takes hold, the individual no longer needs to be corrected externally. They begin to self-correct. Another key feature of the cognitive hook is asymmetry of authority. Gaslighting often unfolds in contexts where one person's framing carries more weight due to expertise, confidence, social status, institutional backing, or simply emotional composure. This authority is rarely declared outright. It is implied through tone, pacing, and the consistent calmness with which alternative interpretations are dismissed. The gaslighting voice does not argue. It explains, and explanation carries authority. Over time, the individual learn, often unconsciously, that their own interpretations are provisional, while the others are definitive. This asymmetry becomes internalized. Even in the absence of the gaslighting voice, the internal monologue continues the work. Maybe I'm not seeing this clearly. They're usually more objective than me. I should probably check myself. At this point, gaslighting no longer requires active input. The cognitive hook has been set. Within the resonance matrix framework, this is understood as a disruption in epistemic trust, the trust an individual has in their own capacity to know. This trust is foundational. Without it, perception becomes unstable and meaning loses its anchor. Importantly, this destabilization does not feel dramatic. It feels subtle, civilized, even intelligent. There are no raised voices, no obvious contradictions, just a persistent sense that certainty is somehow inappropriate. This is why gaslighting so often coexists with apparent rationality. The environment feels calm, the dialogue feels measured, and yet something essential is being eroded. One of the most insidious aspects of gaslighting's cognitive hook is that it reframes discomfort as error. When an interaction leaves you unsettled, uneasy, or vaguely disoriented, the default assumption becomes that the discomfort originates internally. You are tired, you are stressed, you are triggered, you are projecting past experiences onto the present. Again, none of these explanations is inherently false, but when they are applied reflexively, without room for external causation, they redirect attention away from the relational field and back onto the self. This creates a closed loop. Every signal of misalignment is interpreted as a personal processing issue rather than a meaningful response to the environment. Cognitively, this produces a specific pattern, hyper-reflection without resolution. The mind turns inward repeatedly, analyzing reactions, revisiting conversations, reinterpreting tone and intention. But because the reference point has been destabilized, analysis never lands. There is no conclusion, only further questioning. This is exhausting, and exhaustion further reduces confidence. The individual becomes increasingly reliant on external cues to orient themselves, seeking reassurance, clarification, or validation. Ironically, this reliance often strengthens the very dynamic that caused the destabilization in the first place. It is important to note that gaslighting does not require malicious intent to function. Many individuals who engage in gaslighting genuinely believe their version of events. Others are defending against their own discomfort, shame, or uncertainty. Still others are reproducing patterns learned in earlier relational environments. From a cognitive perspective, intent is secondary. What matters is the effect on epistemic stability. Gaslighting is defined not by what someone means, but by what happens to the other person's capacity to trust their own knowing. In collective contexts, this cognitive hook scales rapidly. When institutions, media, or cultural narratives repeatedly invalidate lived experience while presenting themselves as neutral, rational, or evidence-based, individuals begin to doubt not only specific perceptions but perception itself. Reality becomes something that must be externally authorized. In these environments, questioning the narrative is framed not as inquiry but as irrationality. Emotional responses are dismissed as anecdotal. Pattern recognition is labeled bias. Certainty is framed as dangerous. Once again, doubt is moralist, and once again, the internal reference point erodes. Emerging research in psychology and philosophy has begun to describe this phenomenon as epistemic injury, harm done to a person's capacity to know, rather than to what they know. This shift is significant. It moves the focus away from content, beliefs, opinions, memories, and toward process, how meaning is formed and trusted. Gaslighting sits squarely within this emerging framework. It is not simply about deception. It is about dislocating the mechanism of knowing. At this stage in the episode, it is important not to rush toward resolution. The cognitive hook must be fully seen before it can be loosened. Many people attempt to solve gaslighting by collecting evidence, rehearsing arguments, or confronting contradictions. These strategies often fail because they operate at the wrong level. Gaslighting does not collapse under proof. It collapses when the individual recognizes that their doubt has been recruited. That recognition does not restore certainty immediately, but it begins to restore orientation. In the next section, we will move beneath cognition into the body, tracing how this sustained doubt registers physiologically. We will examine what happens when the nervous system adapts to chronic uncertainty and how the loss of an internal anchor is experienced not as panic, but as subtle hesitation, delay, and self-silencing. For now, stay with this insight. Gaslighting works not because you are naive or weak, but because you value understanding, and that value, once inverted, becomes the very mechanism through which certainty is taken from you. The somatic blueprint, when the body loses its reference before gaslighting ever becomes a question of truth. It is a question of orientation. Long before the mind begins to argue with itself, the body begins to hesitate. This is the crucial point most explanations miss. Gaslighting does not begin by changing what you think. It begins by changing how safe it feels to register what you sense. And the nervous system is exquisitely sensitive to this shift. The body is not waiting for evidence. It is tracking for consequences. Every interaction teaches the nervous system something about what happens when it signals discomfort, names a mismatch, or holds a boundary. Over time, these lessons accumulate into patterns of anticipation. This is where gaslighting leaves its deepest mark, not as confusion, but as somatic doubt. Under healthy conditions, perception moves through the body quickly and coherently. A sensation arises, a tightening, a warmth, a sense of misalignment, and the nervous system uses that signal to orient behavior. You speak, you adjust, you move closer or further away. The system completes its loop. In gaslighting environments, that loop is interrupted. A sensation arises, but instead of leading to orientation, it leads to reconsideration. The body still signals, but the signal no longer has authority. Neurophysiologically, this involves a subtle but persistent disruption in interoception, the brain's ability to accurately read internal bodily states. The insula, which integrates visceral sensation with subjective awareness, begins to downweight incoming signals, not because the signals are wrong, but because responding to them has repeatedly led to relational friction, correction, or withdrawal. This is not a failure, it is an adaptation. When the nervous system learns that acting on internal signals threatens connection, it learns to delay them. Gaslighting rarely triggers a clean fight or flight response. That would be too obvious. Instead, it produces a state of low-grade autonomic ambiguity. The person remains socially engaged, and ventral vagal tone is not fully lost, but it becomes unstable. The system oscillates between engagement and self-protection. Muscles subtly brace. Breath becomes shallower. Speech slows or becomes more careful. There is a persistent sense of waiting. Waiting for clarification. Waiting for permission. Waiting for the other person's response to determine what is real. This is the somatic signature of gaslighting. Neuroception, the nervous system's unconscious detection of safety and threat, plays a central role here. Gaslighting environments are particularly destabilizing because they mix safety cues with invalidation cues. Tone is calm, facial expression is neutral or reassuring, language is measured, but meaning destabilizes. Because the threat is not loud, neuroception does not mobilize strong defenses. The system stays engaged longer than it should. It continues to seek a resolution within the field that is causing the disruption. This prolonged engagement under uncertainty is where neuroplastic learning occurs. Neuroplasticity does not care about truth, it cares about repetition and consequence. If every attempt to name discomfort results in being told you are mistaken, oversensitive, or misremembering, the brain begins to associate self-expression with error. Over time, the predictive models update. My sensations are not reliable. My reactions create problems. I need external confirmation before acting. This update is not conscious, it is procedural. It becomes the background setting through which future experiences are filtered. One of the most overlooked aspects of gaslighting is that it often produces somatic compliance without cognitive agreement. People will say, I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't explain it. Or I felt off every time, but I kept staying. Or my body was tense, but my mind kept trying to make it make sense. This is because the nervous system has learned not to escalate. It has been learned that escalation does not resolve uncertainty, it increases it. So the system chooses the strategy that preserves connection, suppression, appeasement, silence. Over time, this produces a specific bodily experience. The person may feel a delay between sensation and speech, a tightening in the throat when trying to name concerns, a collapse in energy after interactions, a vague sense of disorientation rather than clear fear or exhaustion that doesn't match events. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of adaptive inhibition. The body is trying to protect the individual from repeated relational destabilization by reducing signal strength. Importantly, gaslighting does not require overt stress hormones to be effective. Cortisol spikes are not always present. Instead, there is often a slow erosion of baseline coherence. The system never fully settles. It never fully mobilizes. It hovers. This hovering state is metabolically expensive. It taxes attention, memory, and emotional regulation. And because there is no clear threat, the person often blames themselves for feeling depleted. From the resonance matrix perspective, this is the somatic receipt of gaslighting, not panic, not terror, but the loss of trust in the first signal. And once the first signal is distrusted, cognition takes over prematurely, trying to interpret, justify, and rationalize what the body no longer feels authorized to decide. That sets the stage for the next layer, the field case study. Gaslighting as an environment, not an event. To understand gaslighting, it helps to stop looking for moments and start looking for fields. Gaslighting does not happen in a single conversation. It happens across a pattern of interactions where the same outcome repeats. Your perception loses standing. Imagine a relational context, not dramatic, not overtly abusive, not chaotic. On the surface, it looks functional. Conversations continue, plans are made, life moves on, but within the field, something has shifted. At first, the person notices small things, a change in tone, a warmth that fades unpredictably, an inconsistency between words and presence. Nothing concrete enough to accuse, just enough to register. They bring it up carefully. I might be wrong, but something felt different earlier. The response is calm. I think you're reading into it. The conversation moves on, but the sensation does not resolve. Over time, the pattern repeats. Each time the person names a sensation, the response reframes it as a misinterpretation, sometimes gently, sometimes with concern, sometimes with irritation masked as patience. You're overthinking. That's not what I meant. You're too sensitive to these things. Nothing explodes. No one yells. No one leaves. But the person begins to notice a new behavior in themselves. They hesitate before speaking. They start rehearsing what they're going to say, trying to make it airtight. They anticipate counter-arguments. They soften their language. They add disclaimers, and still, the response is the same. No agreement, no curiosity, only correction. Crucially, this correction often comes without reciprocal inquiry. The other person does not ask, what made it feel that way for you? They assert their framing as sufficient. This creates an asymmetry. One person's perception is treated as data to be examined. The other is treated as ground truth. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. Friends see normal interaction. Colleagues see professionalism. Family members see politeness. But inside the field, the person begins to feel alone with their perception. They may start checking themselves constantly, asking others for validation, replaying conversations, searching for explanations, and each time they do, the field tightens. Because the more uncertain they become, the more reasonable the gaslighting response appears. Eventually, the person notices something else. They are always the ones adapting. They adjust their tone, their timing, their expectations, their boundaries. The other person remains consistent. This consistency is often mistaken for stability, but in reality, it is control of framing. The most disorienting part is that the person often feels guilty for withdrawing. They leave conversations early because their body feels unsafe, but to observers, it looks like avoidance. They stop engaging deeply, but it looks like distance. They pull back, but it is framed as abandonment, and when they try to explain why, they cannot find language that is concrete enough to survive scrutiny. Because gaslighting leaves no bruises, only erosion. What finally breaks the spell is rarely a single revelation. It is often a moment of clarity that comes after distance. When the person is no longer inside the field, their nervous system begins to recalibrate. Signals strengthen, breath deepens, spontaneity returns, and with that return comes grief. Grief for how much energy was spent doubting oneself. Grief for how long it took to leave. Grief for how invisible the harm was. This is why gaslighting is so effective. It operates in the space between intention and impact, between reason and sensation, between what can be proven and what can only be felt. This is why understanding the field matters. Because once you see gaslighting as an environmental pattern, not a personal failure, the shame dissolves. You were not weak. You were not irrational. You were adapting to a field that trained you to distrust yourself. Language patterns, how meaning is quietly rewritten. Gaslighting is often described as a distortion of reality. But the deeper distortion happens earlier than reality. It happens at the level of reference, the internal mechanism that decides what counts as signal, what counts as noise, and what counts as me being dramatic. Language is not simply a conveyor belt for information. It's a regulator, a social force that tells the nervous system what is safe to express, what is safe to feel, and what is safe to believe. And long before a listener agrees with a narrative, their brain is doing something more primitive. It is updating its predictions about what happens when they speak, when they disagree, when they name discomfort, when they trust a sensation. In the context of gaslighting, language does not usually arrive as a blunt contradiction. It arrives as an upgrade, a refinement, a correction offered in a tone that implies competence. It says, let's be reasonable, let's be objective, let's calm down. It frames itself as stability, and the human brain, built for social belonging and threat avoidance, tends to treat stability as a cue for safety. This is where it begins, not in the content, but in the calibration. Because gaslighting language does not have to convince you of a new reality. It only has to convince your brain that your own reality requires external validation. Once that happens, the internal reference point becomes negotiable, and a negotiable reference is the beginning of erosion. There are a few distinct language pattern families that do this. They operate like different delivery systems for the same outcome, the weakening of the first signal. One family is what we might call a reasonable dismissal. It's not hostile, so it doesn't trigger the kind of immediate defensive response that would anchor your memory or sharpen your perception. It feels like a normal conversation. It sounds like adult maturity, but it contains a hidden instruction. Your perception is not reliable enough to carry weight. Let's not make a big deal out of this. You're reading into it. You're overthinking again. I think you've misunderstood. The brain is not just processing these as semantic content. It's tracking them as social contingencies. In the background, an ancient circuitry is asking, if I keep speaking from my perception, will connection be threatened? Will I be corrected? Will I be made small? Will I be seen as unstable? And this is where neuroception comes in. Neuroception is the nervous system's fast, unconscious assessment of safety and threat cues in the environment. It isn't a conscious thought. It's a felt reading of tone, facial microsignals, pacing, and contextual power. It can be accurate or inaccurate, but it is fast, and it shapes what comes next. Gaslighting exploits that. It often maintains a surface tone of composure and calm, so neuroception reads safe enough, but the content subtly destabilizes, so the body doesn't mobilize into clear fight or flight. It stays engaged. It stays conversational. It stays open, which means the brain continues updating predictions under conditions of social exposure. This matters because learning neuroplastic change is strongest when the brain is in a state of significance, social consequence, emotional relevance, belonging, risk, identity, threat. Gaslighting doesn't need to create panic. It only needs to create consequences. And the consequence it creates is simple. If you trust your internal signal, you will be corrected, doubted, reframed, or subtly shamed. Over time, the nervous system becomes less willing to generate signals at full strength. It starts compressing perception before it becomes speech. It starts softening statements. It starts pre-apologizing for awareness. That's the first major linguistic pattern of gaslighting. It encourages a person to become an editor of their own sensation. Another family is what we could call concern masked invalidation. This is where gaslighting becomes even harder to spot because it arrives wearing empathy. I'm worried about you. I think you're not yourself lately. I don't want you spiraling. I'm saying this because I care. Again, any one of these could be sincere in a healthy relational field. The issue is not the phrase, it's the trajectory. In gaslighting dynamics, concern isn't used to make you feel held. It's used to make your perception feel pathological. The implication is that the problem isn't what you noticed, it's that you noticed. This directly impacts the brain's predictive machinery. A core function of the brain is predictive processing. It constantly compares incoming sensory data to internal models of what should be happening. When there's a mismatch, the brain can either update the model or reinterpret the data. In healthy dialogue, mismatch becomes inquiry. Tell me more. What did you mean? What did you notice? In gaslighting, mismatch becomes correction. That's not what happened. That's not what I meant. That's not how it is. But because the correction is delivered with calm concern, the listener's brain gets a second message on top of the correction. If you disagree, you are unstable. That message is not always explicit, but the nervous system hears it. And here's the neurobiological pivot. When a person repeatedly experiences their perceptions being reclassified as too emotional or too sensitive, the brain begins to treat interoceptive signals, internal body sensations, as untrustworthy data. Over time, the insula, a region involved in interoception and subjective feeling states, the anterior cingulate cortex, conflict monitoring, error detection, and the hippocampal memory systems can become biased toward uncertainty. The person doesn't just doubt the other. They begin to doubt themselves at the level of felt knowing. That's the second major linguistic pattern. It trains the body to experience its own alarm as embarrassment. A third family is false neutrality. This one is extremely common in workplaces, institutions, and professional environments, and it's one of the most culturally protected forms of gaslighting because it looks like rationality. Let's stick to facts. Let's be objective here. That's just your perspective. Can you prove that? Let's not bring emotion into it. Notice what happens. The speaker frames themselves as a neutral authority and frames the other person as biased. But the neutrality is often selective. It is applied to the listener's perception, not to the speaker's framing. Psychologically, this triggers a subtle status asymmetry. One person becomes the judge, the other becomes the defendant. And once you're in a defendant position, your brain begins to prioritize compliance cues. How to say things correctly, how to avoid being dismissed, how to keep the conversation reasonable. This is where the prefrontal cortex comes in, not as a superhero, but as a manager. When we're socially exposed, we rely heavily on prefrontal regulation, selecting words, inhibiting impulses, and crafting acceptable responses. But if that prefrontal effort is repeatedly met with reframing and dismissal, it creates a fatigue loop. The brain learns, no matter how carefully you communicate, your perception will be repositioned as subjective noise. So the person begins to withdraw from meaning making. They still speak, but less. They choose safer topics. They say it's fine even when it isn't. They stop naming inconsistencies, not because they don't notice them, but because the field has trained them that noticing costs too much. That is the third major linguistic pattern. It turns clarity into a social liability. A fourth family is retroactive rewriting, language that reassigns meaning after the fact. That's not what I said. You're twisting my words. You're remembering it wrong. I never meant that. You always do this. Retroactive rewriting is devastating because it targets memory and sequence. The hippocampus doesn't store experience like a camera. Memory is reconstructive. It is shaped by context, emotion, repetition, and social feedback. If social feedback consistently contradicts your reconstruction, your confidence in that reconstruction weakens, even if the original signal was accurate. And in gaslighting, the contradiction is rarely delivered as, you're wrong. It's delivered as, that's not how it was, which subtly implies, if you insist, you are dishonest or unstable. The brain then enters conflict monitoring mode. The anterior cingulate cortex lights up when there is a contradiction between expected and received signals. But if contradiction becomes chronic and unresolved, the system can fall into what feels like cognitive fog, too much conflict, no resolution. The nervous system doesn't like unresolved contradictions. It will choose the path that restores coherence fastest, even if it costs truth. This is why gaslighting often produces a particular kind of mental exhaustion. You spend so much energy trying to maintain accurate narrative sequence that your ability to feel clear collapses under the workload. That is the fourth major linguistic pattern. It turns memory into negotiation. A fifth family is identity framing, language that assigns a trait to the perceiver rather than engaging the perception. You're always paranoid. You're insecure. You're controlling. You're dramatic. You're too sensitive. Identity framing is efficient because it bypasses content entirely. If you can make the person's perception evidence of their type, you never have to address the perception. The conversation ends before it begins. Neurobiologically, identity framing is potent because identity threat is processed as social threat. Humans evolved within groups. Being positioned as irrational or unstable carries belonging consequences. When belonging is at stake, neuroception prioritizes appeasement and safety, often at the expense of clarity. And here is where neuroplasticity becomes central. Neuroplasticity is not just the brain changing, it's the brain changing in response to repeated patterns of consequence. When language repeatedly punishes perception with shame or dismissal, the brain learns to avoid perception-driven expression. Over time, this can become an automatic response. The person notices something, then instantly doubts it, then instantly down-regulates it. This is not a character flaw, it is adaptive learning. That's the fifth major pattern. It links self-trust to social punishment. Now, rather than leaving this as abstract categories, let's place it inside a step-by-step relational scenario, because gaslighting is not a list, it's a rhythm. Imagine a relationship between two people, no gender, no villain, just a relational field where one person over time becomes the dominant framer of reality. It begins with small moments. The first person says, when you said that earlier, it felt dismissive. They're not accusing, they're naming a sensation. They're offering a bridge. They're trying to repair. In a healthy field, the response might be curiosity. I didn't realize. Tell me what landed. But here the response is calm correction. I think you're taking it the wrong way. In that moment, something is planted. Not a belief, but a question. Maybe my perception is unreliable. The first person feels a slight internal mismatch, but the tone is calm. The correction is reasonable. Neuroception reads the other person as composed. So the first person softens. They try again, maybe. But I still felt it. Now comes concern masked invalidation. I'm just worried you're spiraling again. You've been on edge lately. Notice the shift. The perception is no longer being discussed. The perceiver is being diagnosed. The first person's brain now has to manage two tasks at once: defend the perception and defend the self-image. This is cognitively expensive. Most brains will choose the shortest path to resolution, concede uncertainty. So the first person says, maybe I'm just tired. That concession is not the truth. It is a regulation, and the other person relaxes. The field returns to smoothness. That smoothness becomes reinforcement. When you doubt yourself, the connection stabilizes. Neuroplastic learning begins there. Days later, another moment arises. The first person notices a shift, subtle but real. The other person's warmth fades, their engagement feels thinner, and the atmosphere changes. The first person doesn't have proof. They have a bodily reading. They say something feels off between us. Are you okay? Again, a healthy response would be exploration. But here comes false neutrality. You always do this. You create problems out of nothing. Stick to facts. What exactly happened? The first person tries to answer. But what happened is not an event. It's a pattern. Its tone, its energy, its relational microshifts. Those are hard to convert into facts in a way that satisfies a courtroom-style framing. So the first person begins explaining too much. They start trying to translate intuition into evidence. They mention small details, shorter replies, lack of eye contact, coldness. The other person dismisses each detail as misinterpretation. That's not what it was. You're reading into it. You're projecting. The first person feels the internal fog begin, not because they're stupid, but because the brain is now trying to reconcile. My body says something is wrong. The field says nothing is wrong. My body says this mismatch matters. The field says the mismatch is my instability. The first person stops trusting the body, not fully, but enough. And notice the final move, retroactive rewriting. You're twisting everything. I didn't do that. You're remembering it wrong. Now the first person is not just confused, they're disoriented in time. They start replaying the conversation. They wonder whether they really did distort. They become less confident in the narrative sequence. They begin checking with friends. They begin searching online. They begin asking, am I gaslighting them? Am I the problem? That's when gaslighting becomes self-sustaining, because the cognitive hook has been set. Doubt feels like intelligence, and self-trust feels like arrogance. Over months, this scenario repeats in different shapes, not dramatic enough to explode, just consistent enough to train. The first person begins speaking with qualifiers. I might be wrong. Maybe it's just me. I don't know. They apologize for their feelings before they express them. They present perceptions like accusations, because they've learned they will be treated as such. Eventually, they stop bringing up misalignments at all. They either go quiet or they become reactive. And if they become reactive, that reaction is used as evidence that they're unstable, which completes the loop. From the outside, it looks like relationship problems. From the inside, it feels like losing your mind. From a resonance matrix lens, it is the slow erosion of internal reference through linguistic micro-conditioning. Now let's bring in the deeper neurobiology without losing narrative. When a person repeatedly experiences invalidation of perception, The brain begins to treat perception as uncertain input. The conflict monitoring systems become more active. The person experiences more cognitive load in social situations. They may ruminate, replay, and attempt to get it right. The prefrontal cortex works harder to craft acceptable narratives. But because gaslighting responds not to accuracy, but to control of meaning, no narrative is ever right enough. That ongoing mismatch drives stress physiology. Not necessarily acute panic, but chronic strain. And chronic strain biases the brain towards safety strategies: appeasement, withdrawal, silence, compliance. The person becomes less spontaneous. They begin managing themselves. This is where neuroplasticity becomes tragic. The brain changes toward whatever reduces social threat. If self-trust increases conflict, self-trust is inhibited. If doubt restores smoothness, doubt is reinforced. Neuroception, meanwhile, becomes confused, because the threatening signal is not loud. It is mixed with warmth. It is delivered calmly. So the nervous system cannot easily categorize the environment as unsafe. It stays engaged longer than it should. It adapts inside the field rather than exiting it, and the longer adaptation occurs inside the field, the more the brain updates its predictions. My signals are not reliable, my emotions are excessive, my memory is negotiable, my intuition is dangerous. This is why when gaslighting ends, even when the relationship ends, the after effects can persist. The field is gone, but the predictive model remains. People describe this as: I still doubt myself, I still feel unsure, I still second guess everything. This is not because the gaslighter is still present. It's because the person's nervous system learned a new default, outsource reference, and this is where your future-looking focus belongs, even in this language pattern section, because the future of psychological understanding is likely to shift away from simplistic labels and toward process-based descriptions like this: epistemic injury, interoceptive destabilization, coherence disruption, relational prediction bias. Gaslighting will increasingly be understood not merely as emotional abuse, but as a form of environmental conditioning that changes the way the brain assigns confidence to internal signals. It is not just that someone made you doubt reality. It is that your brain learned, through repeated linguistic consequences, to assign lower confidence weights to your own sensory and emotional data. That's a very different claim, and it's more accurate. It also avoids moral panic, because it makes room for complexity. Sometimes people gaslight intentionally. Sometimes they do it defensively. Sometimes they reproduce institutional norms. Sometimes entire systems gaslight without a single individual being consciously manipulative. But in all cases, the effect is measurable in the same place: the confidence the nervous system assigns to internal reference. So if we want to name the core language pattern of gaslighting in one line, it is this: gaslighting language does not argue with what you said. It changes what it means for you to say anything at all. It shifts the conversation from content to credibility, from experience to stability, from signal to diagnosis. And that is why it is so eroding, because once credibility becomes the battleground, the perceiver begins defending themselves rather than listening to themselves. Once that happens, internal reference can be rewritten quietly, without force, without drama, and without proof. This is why gaslighting is effective. It doesn't need to convince the mind. It only needs to make the mind question the body's first signal. Once that first signal is routinely doubted, the person becomes easier to steer, not because they are weak, but because they are no longer certain where self ends and the field begins. Before we move forward, it's worth slowing down here, because once you recognize gaslighting as a field rather than an event, something subtle happens. The question is no longer what did they mean, or was I right or wrong? The question becomes quieter and more foundational. What happened to my reference point while I was inside that environment? This is often the moment people feel both relief and grief at the same time. Relief, because the confusion finally makes sense. Grief, because the cost becomes visible, not as drama, but as erosion of energy, of confidence, of immediacy. And it's important to name this clearly. Understanding gaslighting does not immediately restore clarity. Naming the pattern does not instantly rebuild trust in perception. Insight alone does not reverse biological learning, because what was affected wasn't just belief, it was orientation. Your nervous system learned to delay itself. Your body learned to hesitate before speaking. Your awareness learned to wait for permission. So the next movement in this episode is not about analyzing language further or revisiting the past. It's about something quieter and more practical. It's about how orientation returns, not through confrontation, not through proof, not through trying to win reality back, but through the slow re-establishment of the space where perception can arise before it is corrected. In the next section, we move into what the resonance matrix calls the sovereign shield, not as armor and not as defense, but as the recovery of the interval that gaslighting collapses. The gap between sensation and explanation, between signal and story, between what you feel and what you are told it means. That gap is where reference lives, and that's where we go next. The sovereign shield reclaiming the ineffable gap. Manual override without armor. There is a temptation, once you finally see gaslighting clearly, to rush toward action, to correct the record, to explain what happened, to win back the narrative, to rebuild certainty through evidence, logic, or confrontation. That impulse is understandable because gaslighting leaves behind a particular kind of hunger, the hunger to be believed, not only by others, but by yourself. But the sovereign shield is not built through argument. It is built through reorientation, because what was injured wasn't your intelligence. It wasn't your morality. It wasn't your capacity to reason. What was weakened was something more basic and more delicate. The interval between sensation and collapse. The space in which an internal signal arises and is allowed to exist long enough to be felt, named, and trusted before it is edited. In the resonance matrix, we call this interval the ineffable gap, not because it is mystical or vague or beyond language in a romantic sense, but because it is the pre-verbal space where your nervous system registers truth before your mind begins negotiating it. It is the small internal breath between stimulus and response, the micro moment in which you can notice what is happening in you without immediately assigning it a story. Gaslighting collapses this gap. It trains the system to leap from sensation straight into self-correction. It turns the internal pause into a courtroom. It makes your first signal feel like a liability that must be justified, refined, or muted. The sovereign shield is not a technique to fight gaslighting. It is a way of reopening the gap, a way of letting sensation arrive and remain long enough to regain authority. This is why it is called a shield, not a sword, not a weapon, not a strategy, not a performance. A boundary of perception, a return to internal reference. The first principle of the sovereign shield is deceptively simple. You stop trying to interpret the signal before you can feel it. This is harder than it sounds, because most people who have been gaslit become excellent interpreters. They become skilled at reading tone, anticipating reactions, predicting outcomes, and adjusting their expression to reduce conflict. Their minds become finely tuned to external regulation. But this tuning has a cost. It pulls awareness out of the body and into surveillance. The sovereign shield begins by reversing that direction, not by withdrawing from the world, but by restoring the internal sequence. Sensation first, interpretation second. When you reopen the gap, you do not immediately know what it means. You simply know that it is there. That is enough to begin. In practice, the gap often reappears as something small, almost embarrassingly basic. A tightening in the throat when you are about to speak. A subtle contraction in the chest when a certain tone is used. A shift in the stomach when a sentence lands as reasonable but leaves you dumber. A sense of heaviness when you are told you are overthinking. A moment where your body wants to pull away, even if your mind wants to stay polite. In gaslighting fields, these signals are usually dismissed quickly. You were trained to treat them as noise. The sovereign shield asks you to treat them as data again, not as verdicts, not as accusations, not as proof, but as somatic receipts. They do not need to be argued with. They do not need to be justified. They need to be noticed. The second principle is equally important. You stop outsourcing your first reference point. One of the most common after effects of gaslighting is the compulsion to check, to ask others if you're being unfair, to reread messages, to replay conversations, to look for confirmation that you're not imagining it. Again, this is understandable. Gaslighting disrupts epistemic trust, and the mind tries to repair trust by gathering external witnesses. But there's a quiet paradox here. The more you outsource, the more you reinforce the original injury. Because the injury was not that your perceptions were wrong. The injury was that your perceptions were treated as requiring external authorization. The sovereign shield does not ban external support. It simply restores hierarchy. External input can assist later, but it should not replace the first signal. The gap is where the first signal becomes stable again. Now we need to be precise about what this shield is not. It is not hypervigilance. It is not scanning people for danger. It is not trust your gut as a moral command, because the nervous system can be shaped by trauma, fear, and old conditioning. Sometimes the body signals a threat where there is none. Sometimes it freezes because of history, not reality. So the sovereign shield is not about treating every sensation as truth. It is about treating every sensation as information, and information is allowed to exist without immediate judgment. This is what makes the gap sovereign. You do not have to act on the signal to honor it. You only have to stop erasing it. Here is the manual override in its simplest form, without turning it into a technique. When you notice the first flicker of self-doubt, do not chase the thought. Do not debate it. Do not try to be reasonable too quickly. Instead, orient to three things. 1. Where in my body did this begin? Not why, not what it means, just where. 2. What changed in the atmosphere just before I doubted myself? A tone shift, a pause, a look, a sentence, a correction. 3. What do I feel compelled to do right now? Explain more, apologize, prove, withdraw, collapse. This is the gap. This is the moment gaslighting usually steals from you, and it is the moment you can reclaim without confrontation, because you are not fighting anyone. You are simply refusing to abandon your perception at the first request. Within MLH field theory, this matters because gaslighting is not just interpersonal, it is field-based. It is environmental. It is a frequency, an atmosphere that trains nervous systems into deference. When a field is saturated with the same corrective signals, the brain begins to mirror the field's assumptions. Language becomes software, tone becomes command. Social consequence becomes conditioning. The sovereign shield interrupts this mirroring, not by rejecting language, but by inserting the gap where language can be received without immediate obedience. In other words, you stop hosting the broadcast. You become the observer of the signal, rather than the container for the script. This is the shift from entrained subject to resonant observer, not an identity, not a badge, a nervous system stance. Over time, reopening the gap does something subtle and powerful. It restores epistemic trust through repetition, because trust is not rebuilt by a single insight. It is rebuilt by consistent evidence that your internal signals can be noticed without punishment. Each time you pause and feel rather than instantly correct yourself, you give the nervous system a new outcome. Instead of signal to shame and suppression, it becomes signal to pause, and then pause to awareness as a conscious choice. This is neuroplastic change in its quietest form, not dramatic, not performative, but cumulative. This is why gaslighting weakens over time when the gap returns, because gaslighting depends on speed. It depends on the immediate collapse of self-trust. The faster you self-correct, the smoother the field stays. The gap slows that process. In slowing it, you regain a kind of power that doesn't look like dominance. It looks like a presence. Now let's bring this down to lived reality, where the shield becomes felt rather than conceptual. You are in conversation. A familiar phrase lands. You're overthinking. The tone is calm. It could even be affectionate. Your body reacts, perhaps a slight contraction in the chest, a tightening in the throat, a drop in energy. The old pattern would be immediate compliance. Oh yeah, maybe I am. But the sovereign shield is a different response, even if you say nothing outwardly. It is the internal act of staying with the signal for 2 seconds longer than usual, just long enough to notice. Something in me contracted when that was said. You do not need to accuse. You do not need to argue. You do not need to prove anything. You simply register the receipt. In that registration, you stop the reflexive outsourcing of meaning. Sometimes the shield will lead you to speak. Other times, it will lead you to silence. The shield is not a script, it is an interval. If you do speak, the gap changes how you speak. You stop speaking to persuade, you speak to locate. Instead of, you're gaslighting me, it becomes, something in me tightened when you said that. I'm not ready to dismiss what I noticed. This is not a confrontation. It is a reference, and reference is what gaslighting tries to dissolve. In the long run, the sovereign shield is the restoration of an internal boundary. I am allowed to experience what I experienced before you interpret it for me. I am allowed to feel uncertainty without surrendering authority. I am allowed to pause before making myself wrong. This is how sovereignty returns, not through control of the other person, through the refusal to abandon yourself. As we close this section, let's keep it simple. The sovereign shield is not about becoming tougher or more resilient. It's about becoming clearer. It is not about distrust. It is about internal trust being restored to its rightful place first, not last. And the place to practice it is not in the most dramatic moments. It is in the small ones. In the first flicker of hesitation. In the second, where you feel the urge to apologize for perception. In the pause where you begin to edit yourself. That pause is not a weakness. It is the ineffable gap. The more you allow it to exist, the less any field, person, system, culture, or narrative can tell you what you are allowed to know. When reference collapses, and the lockdown begins, gaslighting does not end with clarity. This is one of the hardest truths to accept once you finally understand what has been happening. There is a belief, often born of relief, that once gaslighting is recognized, it loses its power. Once the pattern is named, orientation returns automatically, and the system resets. Sometimes that happens. More often, it doesn't. Because gaslighting is not the end of influence, it is the threshold. It is the moment when the internal reference point, once eroded, becomes available for something else to occupy it, and that is where phase 3 begins. Throughout this volume, we have been tracing a descent that mirrors the nervous system's gradual loss of autonomy, not through force, but through environment, language, and state manipulation. In phase 1, the environment was groomed. The field was saturated, perception was softened, framed, aligned. In phase 2, engagement became tactical, reality fractured, Emotion was harvested, vigilance was sedated, internal reference was destabilized. Gaslighting sits at the end of this phase for a reason. It is the final preparatory step, because once a person no longer fully trusts their own sensing, memory, or judgment, something else can step in to provide direction, not through argument, not through threat, but through relief. This is the pivot point. Up until now, the individual has still been doing the work, questioning, adjusting, explaining, trying to stay coherent inside the field. Even in confusion, there has been effort. Even in doubt, there has been agency. Gaslighting exhausts that effort. It produces a particular kind of fatigue, not physical tiredness, but epistemic fatigue. The exhaustion that comes from having to second-guess every signal, every memory, every internal cue. And exhausted systems seek resolution, not truth, not justice, only resolution. This is the opening phase that phase 3 requires. Phase 3 is not louder than phase 2. It is quieter, more intimate, more persuasive. It does not need to destabilize perception. That work has already been done. It only needs to offer a way out of the uncertainty. This is where bribery enters. Bribery is often misunderstood because it is imagined as transactional, money, reward, and explicit exchange. But in the resonance matrix, bribery is not defined by objects. It is defined by state substitution. Bribery offers the nervous system a way to stop checking. After gaslighting, the internal world feels unstable. The person no longer trusts their compass. Every decision feels heavy. Every choice feels uncertain. Bribery steps in with a promise that is rarely spoken aloud. You don't have to decide anymore. It offers relief instead of clarity, comfort instead of coherence, belonging instead of orientation. And the body recognizes this immediately. There is often a dirty feeling and sensation that accompanies this offer, not always literal, but felt. A subtle softening that doesn't feel clean, a warmth that feels conditional, a sense of being held, but at the cost of something unnamed. This is why the archetype here is the appeaser's song. It soothes, it reassures, it hums in the background, and it invites compliance not through fear, but through fatigue. Once bribery is accepted, even partially, the system shifts again, because accepting relief at the cost of reference creates dependency, and dependency creates vulnerability. This is where coercion emerges, not as an overt threat, but a structural narrowing. Coercion is the funnel effect, the slow closing of perceived options. Not, you must do this, but this is the only reasonable option. This is the only safe path. This is what people like you do. Choice still exists, technically, but alternatives begin to feel unthinkable. This is not because they are unavailable. It is because the nervous system has learned that deviation leads back into instability, and instability is now intolerable, so the will narrows. Expression simplifies. Dissent feels dangerous, not because of punishment, but because of what it might reawaken: doubt, confusion, loss of orientation. The voice begins to mute itself, not out of fear, out of preservation. At the end of this funnel lies extortion. Extortion is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It arrives as a freeze, total biological shutdown of the agency. At this stage, the nervous system is no longer negotiating. It is no longer choosing. It is no longer even resisting. It is conserving. This is dorsal vagal collapse, not as pathology, but as adaptation. The system has learned that action does not restore safety. Expression does not restore clarity. Questioning does not restore coherence. So it stops. This is the final extraction, not of resources, not in compliance, but of aliveness. Seen this way, the 10-word dissent is not ideological. It is biological. It is the story of how autonomy is lost not through one dramatic act, but through a sequence of environmental and linguistic shifts that slowly teach the nervous system to give up its role as an internal authority. Gaslighting is the last moment where reversal is still relatively accessible. That is why this episode matters so much. There is something else that must be said here, something uncomfortable but necessary. Gaslighting does not only occur in abusive relationships. It occurs in families, in workplaces, in institutions, in cultures, in diagnostic frameworks, in systems that claim neutrality while invalidating lived experience, and increasingly, as we move into more algorithmically mediated environments, gaslighting becomes ambient when platforms rewrite context, when narratives shift without acknowledgement, when emotional response is labeled irrational rather than informative, when perception is treated as bias by default. This is not accidental, it is systemic, which is why future diagnostic and psychological frameworks will need to evolve. The emerging focus will not be, what disorder does this person have, but what environment trained this nervous system to distrust itself. Gaslighting will be understood less as manipulation and more as epistemic injury, damage to the mechanism by which meaning is generated and trusted, and that shift matters, because it moves us away from blaming individuals and toward understanding fields. If there is one integration to hold as this episode closes, it is this. Gaslighting does not make you believe lies. It makes you unsure whether you are allowed to know. Once knowing becomes uncertain, control does not need to be forced. It can be offered gently, wrapped in comfort, wrapped in belonging, wrapped in relief. That is how extraction happens without resistance. This is why phase 3 is called the lockdown, not because of external confinement, but because the internal gate closes, the gate between sensation and action, between perception and expression, between knowing and choosing. Once that gate is shut, the system can be guided anywhere. Yet this is not a story of inevitability, because if phase 3 is the final extraction, then the work of awareness is interrupted, not heroically, not loudly, but precisely where gaslighting first weakened the system, at the return of internal reference, at the reopening of the ineffable gap. That work does not happen all at once, and it does not always reverse the descent immediately, but it restores something essential, the possibility of choice. As we move into episode 8, bribery, we will not begin with an accusation. We will begin with seduction's residue, with the moment when relief feels offered, with the comfort that feels earned, with the warmth that asks you to stop checking, because bribery does not feel like control, feels like kindness, and that is why it works. Until next time, stay with the moment after doubt settles, when uncertainty grows quiet, when relief feels offered, when the system wants to rest its weight somewhere else. Notice what promises to hold you when your own reference feels tired. Not everything that comforts you is aligned, and not everything aligned will ask for your silence. We're moving now into the places where choice is exchanged for ease, where certainty is traded for safety, and where the final descent begins, not with force, but with relief. Thank you for entering this field of exploration. The matrix is not something you escape. It is something you learn to feel and perceive. Once you begin to recognize it through feeling and self-awareness, perception becomes less confined by certainty and more guided by awareness. You've been listening to the Resonance Matrix Volume 2, The Anatomy of Influence and the Linguistic Somatic Decode, Episode 7, Gaslighting. I'm James Miller.